Great. Thank you so much, Melissa. Hi, everyone. So glad that you're here, taking the time out of your busy schedules to do something to benefit your well-being. We're going to be talking about burnout, awareness, prevention, and recovery today. And just before we get into it, some quick things to consider as we get started. We welcome any questions or comments that you have through the chat, and I'll be sure to leave some time at the end to address those. And if there's any questions that we end up not getting to for whatever reason, I'm happy to follow up with you on email. And if you're someone who processes things later, you can also feel free to reach out to us with emails if you have any questions as well. And by the end of today's workshop, you should come away with an increased awareness of what burnout is, signs of burnout, new strategies to prevent burnout, strategies to effectively address burnout if it does occur. So as you all transition from all of your previous tasks, let's just take some time to settle in today, to slow down and make some space for taking in today's information. So maybe take a few intentional breaths, can roll your neck, do some stretches, whatever you need to do to come into this moment and be present with yourself. And as you come into this moment, I'm going to ask you to think about the most expansive and bright version of yourself, the self that feels most like you, feels most whole, present, maybe laughs more, feels connected to that sense of possibility, generally feels lit up. So picture that self, like kind of bring it to mind. Even if you're not feeling it right now, just picture who that self is. And as you bring that image to mind, notice what you're doing. So, like, what sorts of activities, settings, or situations do you find that self in? And maybe even jot some things down if you need. Otherwise, you can keep it in your mind just as you reflect. And I ask this because this is the most resourced version of all of us, the one that feels expansive and whole. And there's really good information in this version of us about what fills each of us up the most and what we can do for ourselves to become a bit more resourced when we need it. So unfortunately, it's not possible to be in this version all the time, and especially when things are going on in our lives and we're feeling stressed, but it can just offer us some great clues about what it is that we need as individuals. And that's going to look very different for each of us. So keep this version of yourself in mind as we go through the rest of the workshop today, and just continue to jot down some things that come to mind as they come to you. And we'll start by identifying what burnout is and how we can identify signs that we're becoming burnt out. A really important thing to acknowledge about burnout is that it's not just an individual issue. So in a poll conducted by Healthy Minds Institute, and this was just in 2024, 31% of college faculty and staff reported that they don't have balance between their personal and professional life in some way. And 51% found that in some way their jobs took a negative toll on their mental or emotional health. So this shows that this issue is larger than just any individual, that it's not that 51% of people don't have the tools to manage burnout, that it's a societal issue. And research shows that burnout's related to this societal messaging about the need to always be productive, to continue to grind, to always be busy in order to be considered valuable. So if you're feeling burnt out right now or you've experienced it in the past, please just bring some compassion to yourself that it's likely that you're trying to cope with some very real demands in the workplace as well as in other areas of your life. And it's really important to recognize the systemic factors that contribute to burnout while also identifying personal changes that each of us can make, because that's where our power lies. So, this presentation is about validating that the demands are real and then also figuring out how do we help ourselves? How do we manage stress before we reach that place of burnout? So, what is burnout? So, it's an occupational phenomenon that occurs when we've basically just been experiencing too much stress for too long. And there's three components of burnout. The first is feeling emotionally exhausted, like you just don't have anything left to give. The second is feeling emotionally distant from your work, that it's maybe hard to be engaged, to care, to have motivation. Work doesn't feel fulfilling anymore, things like that. And then the third component is that there's this sense of reduced professional efficacy, that you don't feel you're accomplishing what you know you're capable of. And that can be real or perceived, but that feeling of, not being able to accomplish things is there. And in general, burnout is associated with, lower quality of work, lower morale, health problems, and even anxiety and depression. So, this is a big issue that we want to manage to the best of our abilities. And here are some signs and symptoms of burnout that are important to be aware of. Some include chronic stress and overwhelm, exhaustion, irritability, feeling kind of easily activated, difficulty concentrating, avoidance of various situations at work, more conflicts with others, difficulties with sleep, um, physical illness, again, sense of ineffectiveness and detachment. And then a couple big ones to note are just a sense of cynicism and then some negative feelings toward coworkers and the self. So for many of us, some symptoms can show up more than others. So just take a moment here to look over these symptoms, identify which ones tend to show up for you most when you're feeling stressed or overwhelmed. And are you noticing any of these in your life right now or in the past? It's a really great thing to be aware of how it shows up for us so that we can detect the early signs. To get into burnout prevention, it's really important to know the process of becoming burnt out, what that looks like, so that we can intervene at earlier stages when possible. And there's 5 phases of burnout. So the first phase of a new job or a new work task, or maybe returning from vacation, we're well resourced. This is the honeymoon phase. In this phase, we're kind of filled up with energy and optimism, and we experience these periods of great productivity. We feel that we're really able to tap into our productive side, and we feel fulfillment and a sense of real satisfaction in this phase. And then eventually, over time, the honeymoon phase dwindles a bit, and we do begin to experience some stress, which can be inevitable. And stress, we'll talk about later, isn't always negative. In this phase, we may begin to notice some physical or mental signs of stress, such as losing focus more easily, feeling less productive, and maybe more fatigued, having some sleep challenges. And this is where we begin to notice brief periods of stress kind of throughout the day or the week. And if that stress isn't addressed or managed in the onset of stress phase, then we can move to this more chronic stress phase. And this is really where we begin to notice more persistent or chronic stress as pressure increases. and our work is likely to be more affected by how stressed we are. We might experience some apathy, start missing some deadlines, more procrastination. Maybe even we withdraw a bit. We might become more irritable with others. And a really important aspect of this phase to note is that this is where we may begin to bring the stress home or into our social lives. So take a moment with these three phases before I move to the next two and just see if you might recognize yourself in any of them, either now or in the past. So just take a few moments here. And then following the chronic stress phase, this is where we find ourselves shifting from stress to burnout if the stress isn't addressed beforehand. So we reach our limit of being stressed. This is where it begins to really affect our functioning, and we can see a big shift in ourselves, and it also can become evident to others in our lives. We might start hearing some feedback from others about how we seem more stressed or have a shorter fuse. We might become more consumed with problems at work. And then there's this feeling like it's impossible to take time for our personal lives or to be present in our personal lives. And we may also experience some numbness, um, and feelings of self doubt in our abilities. And then it's likely that more of these physical symptoms intensify in this phase. And then finally, in the last phase, we can find ourselves in habitual burnout. So if we don't intervene again in these previous phases, burnout can become a part of more of our everyday lives. And this, I think, what's really important to note here is we begin to lose awareness that we're in fact burnt out because it can feel like this is just life now. And so this is where we see more mental health issues increase, along with more fatigue and other physical symptoms that can really interfere with our work lives and our personal lives and just our sense of fulfillment in life, that it can be harder to connect with that uh, more filled up version of ourselves that we thought about at the beginning today. So just take a moment to reflect. Do you see yourself in any of these phases, either now or in the past? And what are some of the signs that you see in yourself when you're approaching these phases or when you are more stressed? What do you hear from others about how your stress shows up? Maybe jot some things down if that's helpful. I'll just take a little time here. Okay, so I know all this might sound a bit scary, but now we're going to talk about what we can do about it. So the question is really like, what's in our control here? And preventing burnout, as I was mentioning before, is all about managing our stress before it grows into the burnout phase. And so it's important to note that not all stress is bad, that it's a response to any demand that's placed on our mind or body, and it occurs along this continuum. So at one end, if there's no stress, we feel quite stagnant, and then in the middle, there's just enough stress to give us a sense of challenge, to experience engagement, fulfillment, but not so much that we're left under resourced and depleted. So that's this kind of this gray area of this graph here. And then at the other end of the continuum, we have distress. And this is where the demands outweigh our capacity to cope with them, which can lead to more suffering and anxiety and overwhelm. So when we aim to prevent burnout, what we're doing is attempting to keep ourselves more or less within this pro stress range on a consistent basis. So again, like the gray area of the chart that or the graph, that there will always be moments of overwhelm or distress, but we're able to return to a baseline of pro stress, that kind of optimal level of stress. And so in optimizing this stress, there's two ways to do this. One is by managing the external sources of stress to stay within that range. And the other is by expanding that range by kind of focusing on increasing our capacity and our internal resources so that we do feel more connected to that well-resourced, more expansive version of ourselves that can then cope with some of the stressors that come our way on a daily basis. So when we apply this model to preventing burnout, there's two avenues. First, we can recognize our workplace demands, how they affect our stress levels over time, and take some action there to hopefully find a workload that's sustainable, receive support from colleagues or supervisors when we need it, and also set realistic expectations of ourselves and realistic goals. Here, I recognize that there are some places where we have control, and there are some places where maybe we don't. So, this is really about accurately assessing your specific situation and figuring out what might be able to work for you to set up work in a way that feels more sustainable. But because this has to do with outside sources of stress, we do have a little less control here, and that's okay. That's an important thing to acknowledge as well, because the place where we have the most control and where we can really focus our efforts in terms of managing stress levels, preventing burnout, is in enhancing this capacity. So that's when our needs are met and we're feeling more filled up, and we actually aren't as affected by each small stressor that would bother us when we have lower capacity. So this is the place where we come back to what you reflected on in the beginning, is when you're most lit up, feeling most whole. What is happening to create that moment for you? And the goal isn't to be in that place all the time, or to say that to prevent burnout, we have to access that place all the time, but it's just to use that as information about what you might need more of in your life to enhance your capacity. And when we break this down further, here are some examples of things that we can do in both of these places to manage our stress. So, with workplace demands and external sources of stress, this would be in recognizing what's actually realistic for you to get done while staying healthy, and shifting goals and expectations where possible to fit this recognition. If possible, thinking about how you work best and where there's flexibility in setting up your daily tasks in a way that maybe works better for your brain or your energy levels. So if you feel more engaged in the morning, for example, using that time to address the tasks that require the most concentration. And finally, when it feels safe to do so, communicating with colleagues or supervisors about what the priorities are and being transparent about what's currently on your plate, seeking support about how you can best manage competing tasks and priorities. And in this category, it's helpful to identify again what you have control over, only if that's a few things in terms of addressing the demands in the workplace. And then moving to, again, the enhancing our capacity, the category where we do have more control, um, so that the stressful events that occur or we find ourselves fielding competing demands, we're able to better cope with them, that they don't push us into that distress range quite as much. And this comes with really committing to meeting our physical needs, to maintaining boundaries when possible. An example is starting and stopping the workday at a reasonable time so that you can protect your time outside of work and use that to meet your needs. Recognizing the first signs of stress and overwhelm as signals to kind of spend more time filling yourself back up so that it's a signal that there's a need not being met when we start to get more irritable or have a harder time focusing or feel a little disconnected. And we can come back to figuring out what it is that we need for ourselves in that moment. That it's not a sign to work harder or to push yourself toward more stress and overwhelm, that it might actually be a sign to turn inward and take a few moments to address that need. And then engaging in activities again that fill you up and give you the opportunity to experience yourself outside of work so that hopefully you can bring that self with you to work. And I know it might seem like there's no time for all these things, but in taking time for our needs, we're actually helping ourselves solve more problems in our lives and prevent that eventual burnout. And that eventual burnout will take more time from us and will ultimately cost us more emotionally, mentally, physically, potentially at our jobs or in our careers. So that slowing down a little bit to address the needs and figure out the solution in the moment actually really benefits us and gives us back some time in the long run. Okay. So prevention is really key because that's where we have a little more capacity to address issues and come up with solutions. But what do we do if we find that we reach the burnout phase, or maybe that's where some of us are right now? Just know that hope is not lost if you're currently feeling burnt out. So we're going to get into what you can do if you find yourself entering the burnout phase, or maybe if you've been there for a while. And the first thing to know about burnout is that it has a way of kind of changing our perspective on what's important. And we can tend to lose access to our sense of self during these times and the permission from ourselves to have balance in our lives. So we'll see this come up when we know what to do and we know what would be helpful, but we find it very difficult to take some action to implementing the changes. So before I discuss the ways to address the issue, it's important to note that we all have these psychological barriers that can keep us from helping ourselves out of this place. And some really common barriers to changing behaviors when we're feeling burnt out can be, the first, hidden assumptions and beliefs about our roles and duties and how our worth connects to our roles and duties. So, are we telling ourselves that we're not as good of an employee or not taking the role seriously if we have to take some time to rest? Or there's no one else that can complete this task, that's only me can do it? Or what would it mean? It might mean something about ourselves if we were to recognize our limits as a human being. So this can be a really limiting one for us. And the first step is just to bring awareness to potentially some of these beliefs about our worth operating under the surface. The second one that comes up a lot is all or nothing thinking. And this shows up in beliefs such as, if we don't do everything perfectly or work until we're exhausted, then we aren't taking the job seriously or we're not doing a good job. Or another way that it can show up is in thoughts around getting our needs met. So if we don't have a full hour to um, exercise, go outside, eat something, connect with a friend, that it isn't worth it. We might as well not do it. So there's a difficulty we can have with recognizing that it's really the small moments that add up throughout the day that lead us to feel healthy, regulated, supported by the end of the day. So the few moments that we take for ourselves here and there really, they really do matter. That it doesn't have to be an hour or nothing. And then oftentimes we'll have anger or frustration at a certain situation that that can come from a feeling of powerlessness. So there's a sense that we shouldn't be in the position to be bringing ourselves out of burnout. And I wouldn't argue with that. That again, burnout is also a systemic issue. But the truth is that there are some things we can do for ourselves and for our well-being, and that we can actually use this anger and this frustration as fuel to make changes to our own lives rather than having it be a barrier to it. So it comes back to, what do I have control over and what do I want to do with that? Like, what decisions are actually going to be helpful for me, even if I'm angry that I've found myself in this situation? That it can be both. I can feel angry and I can make changes that feel better for me and give me back my sense of power in some ways. And then oftentimes, some of the anger can come from a sense of feeling trapped. And when we look closer at this, not all the time, but a lot of the time, some of the feelings of being stuck can come from a lack of permission from ourselves to really take the time and space to attend to our needs. And so, one sign of this is like if you catch yourself with the phrase, like, must be nice, like you see someone taking some time in their workday and you've been running around really stressed. Oh, must be nice to be able to take that time. Those little things, like, just bring some awareness to that, because that's an indication that you want that for yourself and that there's something there where you're not giving yourself permission um, to meet that need. So look over these, see if you notice or recognize any of these barriers if within yourself. We all have them. And I'm going to move on to discussing some antidotes to burnout, and just notice if they pop up for you. Like, well, like that's not possible because of this, or yeah, it must be nice to be able to do this, this, and this, because that is the key to, that's going to be the door to really move through to experience some change. And it starts with the awareness of those things, because we can't change what we're not aware of. So, in addressing burnout, the focus is going to be mainly on our needs rather than what's going on external to us, because what's occurring by the time that we are feeling this burnt out is that we're exhausted, we're disconnected from ourselves and from others, and we're experiencing, a general lack of meaning. And so the first thing that, I was just saying is this begins with increasing awareness around our stress levels throughout the day, that we can't change, excuse me, what we're not aware of. So it takes stepping back for a few moments and conducting regular kind of mental check ins, really taking some time to reflect on some of the signs and symptoms that we're stressed and allowing ourselves to see those things in ourselves. And so, what can be really essential here is taking in the feedback from the people in our lives who know us well, that they often are the first to notice shifts in us before we do. And we can usually trust that what they're saying is based on something that they're noticing. And then we can use that as data for us about what's going on rather than getting defensive, because most of them are really on our sides and they're trying to point something out to us. The second antidote to burnout is going to be an increasing connection to others and opening ourselves up to support, which can be hard when we've been in a perspective of like, I just got to go, go, go. And when these other kind of more psychological barriers come into play of what we're expecting of ourselves. But connection is what makes us feel more like ourselves. And it's where we experience a lot of meaning and purpose and fulfillment and perspective. So this takes noticing when we're isolating, and instead of becoming comfortable in the isolation to some degree, using that again as a signal that we need connection. Um, and this takes expressing our needs or concerns to the people that we trust and allowing the support in. And finally, if it feels impossible or like there's just no hope for change around this issue, then it's really important to seek some professional help and kind of give yourself the gift of that support. That feeling supported in that way alone can open up a sense of hope and help us identify pathways toward greater well being. The third antidote to burnout is to really restore balance in our lives. And again, this is going to take addressing some of the psychological barriers we may have and recognizing that the perspective that burnout creates is one that makes it feel like we shouldn't have balance. So we have to really challenge that and recognize that that's a part of what's going on for us, and that balance will really allow us to expand our internal resources and get back in touch with ourselves and ultimately figure out more solutions to this issue so that we don't, find ourselves back there again. So this can occur through, communicating and maintaining boundaries, um, which can be another hard thing, but is a very important thing. Taking time off when possible. And ideally, we would take time off when we start to notice the first signs of burnout creeping in, like before it's gotten there in the stress phase. That's when we would give ourselves time to rest. But if we're already burnt out, then we really need time to recover when it's possible. And then re engaging with those fulfilling activities. And at the beginning, this might require some more external accountability. So maybe scheduling things with others so that we're really motivated to show up and to give ourselves the opportunity to experience ourselves differently. And then finally, taking care of our emotions and nervous system through emotion regulation. That when we practice more emotion regulation, it allows us to maintain more perspective when stressed and more access to possible solutions. And we find ourselves in a place where we can respond rather than react. So, one of the best emotion regulation techniques is simply to breathe. And it can be surprising how much we're holding our breath throughout the day, especially when stressed. So, just taking like 1 to 3 slower, longer breaths when we're feeling really stressed can make a significant difference. And then the more we do that for ourselves, the more regulated we can find ourselves. The another way to regulate our emotions is to simply bring awareness to what we're feeling and to try to identify it. So, again, feelings often point to needs we have. So, naming the emotion can help us make sense of what we're feeling, why we're feeling what we're feeling, and what we might need to do to address it. And then engaging in some light movement or stretching and changing sensory input through things like getting fresh air, sunlight, even for, challenging that all or nothing thinking, and even for like a minute or two doing that can signal to our nervous systems that we're safe. And that can bring us out of the fight, flight, or freeze response that we can sometimes find ourselves in. So, all of these antidotes require us to um, change how we've been operating and require us to take small moments for ourselves throughout the day and realize that those can actually have quite an impact on our capacity and on helping us to reconnect with ourselves. So take some time now to reflect on, what you know of yourself, your needs when you're feeling most expansive, the signs that you're stressed, and what are some changes, some small changes that you might be able to make to increase your capacity. And we'll take just about a minute here. So hopefully taking some time to reflect on these things can help with just planting some seeds. Like these changes don't all happen overnight, and it's not fair to expect that of ourselves, but planting the seeds over time of what might work for us in, mitigating our stress and preventing burnout where possible. And as that kind of all that information integrates, and before we get to questions, um, let's take some time to actually practice the breathing, give ourselves an opportunity to regulate and see what happens by slowing the breath, regulating the nervous system. So we'll just take a couple minutes and get into a comfortable position. Again, you can kind of do whatever you need in your body to feel like you can settle in. Maybe close your eyes when you're ready or lower your gaze. And just start by bringing awareness to the gentle inflow and outflow of your breath without needing to change it. Notice yourself slowing down a bit as you do that. And And then we're just going to take 3 longer breaths. So in through your nose and out through your mouth. And I'll count. We'll do in for 4 counts. We'll hold for 4 counts. And then we'll exhale through the mouth for 4 counts. All right. So when you're ready, breathe in through your nose. 2, 3, 4. Hold. And out through your mouth. 2, 3, 4. And hold. Again, in through your nose. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Out through your mouth. 2, 3, 4. And hold. 2, 3. And one last time on your own count. In through your nose. And out through your mouth. Before you open your eyes, just sit with what you notice, what's changed, if anything, for you. And as you blink your eyes open, see if you can stay with how your nervous system feels right now. Thank you all so much. We're going to open it up for questions. And just before we do that, we're going to also put in the chat some of our upcoming offerings for, or maybe it's already there. I'm not sure, Melissa, but for anything, if you're wanting to continue to prevent burnout, to take care of your well-being, we have a few offerings coming up later this month and in the beginning of November. And you can find registration links in the chat for those. And we've also placed a survey in the chat. If you'd like to provide us with your feedback from today's workshop, we would love to hear it. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then we can open it up.